Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling and long-buried cases in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, imagine for a moment the quiet rhythm of the old port, the clip of horses over cobblestones, the scent of salt and damp wood along the riverfront, and the heavy silence that still lingers in the humid air of those stately squares. Behind the wrought iron balconies and grand façades of antebellum Savannah lies a tale that few local historians dare to mention. In the year 1839, when the port thrived on commerce, cotton, and the shadow economy of bondage, a merchant named Jonathan Merriweather had established himself among the city's most respected businessmen. The Merriweather residence stood proudly on Oglethorpe Avenue, a three-story brick home with white columns and wrought balconies that spoke of ambition and the confidence of new wealth. By all outward accounts, Jonathan was a successful importer of fine European goods, porcelains from France, silks from Italy, and furniture from England, catering to Savannah's elite. His warehouse along the Savannah River employed more than a dozen men and provided him both prestige and prosperity. Yet hidden beneath this respectable veneer was a darkness that would not come fully to light until more than a century later. The entire scandal came to public awareness, not through court proceedings or newspaper reports, but from a curious marginal note discovered in 1967 during the reorganization of St. Andrew's Parish Church records. In an 1868 notation beside a death entry, a clerk had written, "Merriweather wife not deceased as recorded. Further inquiry forbidden by order of Judge Rutledge." That single line, unearthed by chance during a routine archival assessment, would unravel a conspiracy of silence that had covered Savannah society for nearly 100 years. According to official records, Eleanor Whitmore Merriweather, born in Boston, Massachusetts, was said to have died of yellow fever on September 3, 1839. Her supposed burial site in St. Andrew's churchyard bears a modest marble headstone, weathered and streaked by 2 centuries of rain and coastal wind. The stone reads simply, "Eleanor Whitmore Merriweather, beloved wife, 1817-1839. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Samuel Pritchard, recorded the cause as yellow fever, a diagnosis that in those days was common enough to draw no particular scrutiny. Yet this is where the story begins to diverge from ordinary tragedy. City health records for the late summer of 1839 show no outbreak of yellow fever in Savannah that year. In fact, reports describe that season as unusually mild, with steady breezes from the Atlantic, keeping mosquitoes at bay. The discrepancy might have remained unnoticed had it not been for Caroline Monroe, a doctoral student in public health history at the University of Georgia who, while cross-referencing death and epidemiological records in the 1960s, found the inconsistency and noted the curious case of Mrs. Merriweather. The Merriweather marriage had begun 5 years earlier, in 1834, when Jonathan, then a widowed merchant of 32, traveled to Boston on business. There he met Eleanor Whitmore, aged 22, the daughter of a prominent shipbuilder with strong connections across New England's mercantile circles. Their courtship was brief but passionate, culminating in a winter wedding that seemed to unite northern enterprise with southern ambition. Contemporaries described Eleanor as educated, perceptive, and independent-minded. She had attended a finishing academy in Philadelphia, where she studied literature, botany, and the natural sciences, pursuits not common among women of her generation. Letters she wrote to her childhood friend Abigail Peabody reveal a thoughtful woman with progressive opinions on education and an unease about the moral rot she perceived beneath the South's prosperity. "The practice I now witness daily," she wrote in 1837, "seems a blemish upon the soul of this young nation, and I fear it will someday demand a reckoning." Eleanor's arrival in Savannah that spring attracted considerable interest. Northern wives among the city's merchant class were not rare, but her refinement and intellect quickly set her apart. Servants remembered her as gentle but reserved, kind yet cautious. One domestic, a woman named Millie, later gave a statement to the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866, recounting how her mistress had insisted on teaching a young enslaved girl to read despite Georgia's laws forbidding literacy among the enslaved. The brief note, buried in an unrelated deposition, offers a small window into the growing tension within the Merriweather household. By 1838, The cracks in their marriage were visible to those who paid attention to Savannah's gossip. The Merriweathers began appearing less frequently at social events. When they did, onlookers remarked on their strained manner, the husband's watchful interruptions, the wife's silences that seemed forced. Rebecca Haynes, the observant wife of a local attorney, recorded in a letter to her sister that year, "Mr. Merriweather speaks for his wife in every instance, and she appears ever more like a bird in a cage, too fine for her confinement." Eleanor's health, too, began to decline. Neighbors described her pallor and thinness, leading to whispers of consumption. But those who spoke with her privately said she seemed not ill of the body, but heavy of spirit. Still, none could have imagined the depths of betrayal that lay ahead. After the Civil War, as Union forces took control of Savannah, a young officer named Captain Henry Caldwell was assigned to review confiscated property records. Among the dusty bundles of ledgers and bills of sale, he discovered a document dated August 26, 1839, just 1 week before Eleanor's supposed death. It recorded the sale of one light-complexioned female, age approximately 20 years, to Silas Duval, a trader known to deal in human cargo between Savannah, New Orleans, and Havana. The price, $18.50, was far above market value for a domestic servant. What truly caught Caldwell's attention was the description attached to the sale. Fair complexion, Boston origin, literate, articulate, refined manner. The seller's signature was unmistakable, Jonathan Merriweather. Caldwell dug deeper. Cross-checking harbor records, he found that on August 29, 1839, the merchant ship Belle of the South departed Savannah bound for New Orleans. Among the passengers was Silas Duval, and on the cargo manifest, one servant accompanying. Weeks later, a letter surfaced among seized correspondence in Judge Rutledge's files. Dated October 10, 1839, it read, "The arrangement is concluded as per your instructions." The package delivered to the Spanish gentleman. Communications to cease henceforth. It was signed simply SD. From that point forward, the evidence formed a grim pattern. Eleanor had not died of fever at all. She had been sold, her death falsified, her grave empty, her identity erased. Captain Henry Caldwell's findings might have vanished into the disordered records of Reconstruction had he not been a man of unusual curiosity. In 1866, while overseeing the reclassification of confiscated properties for the Freedmen's Bureau, he took the time to compile a short memorandum on the Merriweather case. The report, preserved in the War Department's archives, summarized the evidence he had uncovered: the falsified death certificate, the bill of sale bearing Jonathan Merriweather's signature, and the letter suggesting that the package, almost certainly Eleanor, had been transferred to an unnamed Spanish buyer. Caldwell, wary of overstepping his mandate, filed his report without commentary beyond a single line. Evidence suggests deception concerning the death of Mrs. Merriweather, possibly to conceal an unlawful sale. For nearly a century afterward, no one read those words. The file gathered dust in Washington until historian Dr. Gerald McKinney, researching Reconstruction-era property seizures in Georgia, stumbled upon it in 1964. McKinney initially assumed Caldwell had misinterpreted the papers, perhaps confusing an enslaved domestic servant's sale with a merchant's wife's death. Only after cross-referencing the captain's report with Caroline Monroe's epidemiological study and the 1868 church notation forbidding further inquiry did the implications become undeniable. What began as a minor archival curiosity revealed itself to be a conspiracy of chilling depth. The deliberate erasure of a woman's existence, sanctioned by Savannah's own professional elite. The question that haunted McKinney and subsequent researchers was simple. Why? Why would a prosperous merchant of Jonathan Merriweather's stature resort to so grotesque an act? The answer, as so often in such matters, lay in money. In April 1839, Merriweather's shipping enterprise suffered a crippling blow when a vessel carrying his cargo from Liverpool, fine silks, crystal, and porcelain, sank off Cape Hatteras. His insurance covered barely half the loss, leaving him heavily indebted. At the same time, Eleanor's family in Boston announced the distribution of her late grandfather's estate. Under Massachusetts law, the inheritance legally belonged to Eleanor. But in Georgia, the doctrine of coverture gave Jonathan full control of any property brought into the marriage. Letters later recovered from a Savannah law office, dated May 1839, show Merriweather's mounting frustration at delays in accessing the funds. He wrote to his Boston attorney, "The interference of her brother William is intolerable. His obstinacy prevents me from liquidating essential obligations. I must have full access to the Whitmore estate without further hindrance." William Whitmore, a shipbuilder like his father, traveled to Savannah that July, likely to confront Jonathan about the inheritance. Surviving records confirm his arrival, but say nothing of what passed between the men. What is known is that by August, William was back in Boston, and within weeks, news of Eleanor's sudden death reached him by post. The family accepted the official explanation without question. Yellow fever was a plausible, even expected danger in southern climates, but no outbreak occurred that year. No doctors beyond Samuel Pritchard signed off on her death. No witnesses outside the household saw her burial. The church's sexton later testified in a deposition, decades after the fact, that the coffin brought to St. Andrew's churchyard was sealed shut before arrival. The facade of tragedy concealed a crime so extraordinary that most contemporaries could not have imagined it. That Merriweather had literally sold his wife into slavery, using her northern birth and light complexion as a disguise for legality, defied comprehension. Yet the evidence, piece by piece, made it impossible to dismiss. Dr. McKinney's investigation drew him inevitably to the house itself, the grand Merriweather home on Oglethorpe Avenue. By the 1960s, it had been subdivided into apartments, its original grandeur faded, but its bones intact. In 1965, during renovations, a construction crew uncovered a sealed section of wall in the cellar. Behind it lay a small leather-bound diary, its pages swollen with damp and age. The legible entries were unmistakably Eleanor's hand. Her final entries, dated early August 1839, offer a haunting glimpse into the days before her disappearance. Jay speaks of debts and obligations, of new ventures in the islands. His temper darkens each day. His patience thins when I inquire after my inheritance. I have written to William, but fear the letter will not leave this house. Last night he took the key from my chamber door. I am watched even as I write. RH has promised to call tomorrow. I pray she does. The initials RH were almost certainly Rebecca Haynes, her friend and neighbor, whose letters later expressed shock at Eleanor's death but offered no details. In September of that same year, Rebecca wrote to her sister in Virginia, "I could not attend the funeral, being unwell myself. I sent flowers. The loss seemed sudden and inexplicable. Thereafter, her correspondence makes no mention of Eleanor again." The diary, authenticated by handwriting experts, confirmed what the paper trail already suggested, that Eleanor had been held under increasing restriction in her own home, that she suspected her husband of financial deception, and that she feared for her safety. The discovery electrified Savannah's small historical community. The local press briefly reported on the Merriweather mystery, but the story faded almost as quickly as it appeared, dismissed by many as a morbid curiosity. Only a handful of academics pursued the matter further. Among them was Dr. Rebecca Harrington, who, in the 1980s, would become one of the leading interpreters of the case. Harrington's later writings argued that the crime, while monstrous, was a logical extension of the power structures of antebellum society. Under coverture, she noted, a wife's identity was legally subsumed into her husband's. She could not own property, file suit, or control her own inheritance. In Merriweather's mind, Eleanor's body and fortune alike were his to dispose of. The act of selling her was not merely the assertion of ownership, but a grotesque fulfillment of a system that already defined her as property in all but name. The discovery of Eleanor's diary provided emotional weight to what had previously been a purely documentary investigation. But it also raised further questions. Who among Savannah's elite had known or helped cover up her fate? Dr. Pritchard, the physician who signed the false death certificate, was a partner in Merriweather's insurance consortium. Judge Rutledge, who ordered inquiries to cease, had financial stakes in several shipping ventures tied to Merriweather's warehouses. The chain of complicity extended beyond one man's greed into the civic institutions that lent it legitimacy. In the years following her death, Merriweather sold his Savannah property and relocated to Mobile, Alabama, where he remarried in 1841. He prospered there as a cotton broker until his death in 1853. No record indicates that he was ever questioned about Eleanor's disappearance. For nearly 125 years, the silence held. Only a few physical remnants, a false headstone, a handful of letters, and a diary hidden in a wall, bore witness to the truth that Savannah society had conspired to forget. And yet, the story did not end there. In 1968, as renovations continued on the Merriweather home, another discovery was made beneath the floorboards of the former parlor, a small wooden box, sealed tight and wrapped in cloth. Inside were personal effects, a hair comb, a pair of gloves, a miniature portrait, and a folded note written in a trembling hand. These belonged to Mrs. M. They should not have been buried in an empty coffin. I have kept them safe until the truth may be known. Thomas Jennings, sexton. The signature matched that of the church's sexton listed in 1839 records. It appeared that at least one man of conscience had recognized the fraud and preserved what he could of Eleanor's memory. The discovery of the wooden box and the sexton's note gave the Merriweather case an almost mythic resonance in Savannah's historical circles. For the first time, tangible evidence tied the falsified burial to human conscience. Thomas Jennings, the church sexton, had been a modest man of mixed descent who served St. Andrew's Parish from 1829 until his death in 1858. Church ledgers showed his meticulous handwriting on hundreds of entries, births, marriages and burials, that he risked his position, perhaps even his safety, to preserve Eleanor's personal effects, suggested he had grasped the enormity of what was being concealed. His simple words, "They should not have been buried in an empty coffin," struck historians as both confession and act of quiet defiance against the machinery of silence. The items Jennings saved were mundane but haunting. The gloves were fine kid leather, too small for anyone but a woman of slight frame. The comb was tortoiseshell, its teeth cracked but intact. The miniature portrait, a likeness of Eleanor painted in Boston before her marriage, showed her with copper blonde hair arranged simply, her eyes direct but gentle, her lips faintly smiling. That image, once an ornament of affection, became a relic of tragedy. When the Savannah Historical Society displayed these items in 1969, the case drew national attention. Newspapers as far away as New York and Chicago published brief articles about "the wife sold south." But interest was fleeting. The story lacked a satisfying ending. Eleanor's ultimate fate remained unconfirmed, and her husband's crime seemed too grotesque for easy comprehension. It wasn't until a decade later that new evidence emerged from an unlikely source. In 1979, a researcher named Louis Fontenot, examining notarial archives in New Orleans for unrelated maritime transactions, found a bill of sale dated October 14, 1839. The document recorded the purchase of one female domestic servant, approximately 25 years of age, fair complexion, English-speaking, literate, transferred from a Spanish trader named Carlos Vega to a French planter identified as Jean-Baptiste Dupré, whose estates lay outside Port-au-Prince in Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti. The woman's name was listed only as Helena. What caught Fontenot's attention was a marginal note in a different hand, formerly in possession of S. Duval, Savannah, that single connection, Duval. The same trader named in Captain Caldwell's report revived the long-dormant investigation. The timing matched precisely. Duval had departed Savannah for New Orleans in late August 1839. A sale in October was plausible if Eleanor had been transported through his network. The purchase price was $2,400, a significant markup from the $1,850 recorded in Savannah. It appeared that Duval had resold his property at a profit, exploiting the woman's refinement and education as valuable traits for managing a wealthy household. Scholars concluded that the Helena in the document was almost certainly Eleanor Merriweather. Her name changed, her identity buried beneath a fabrication. If so, she had been sold yet again, this time into the Caribbean slave market. The French colonies of the 1830s and 1840s were complex territories, where slavery persisted despite nominal emancipation in Haiti proper. The Dupré family, records show, maintained holdings in rural districts where French planters still exercised quasi-feudal authority. For a woman of Eleanor's complexion, education, and demeanor, the likely role would have been that of a household manager or companion rather than a field laborer. Still, the implications were chilling. A woman born free in Boston, daughter of privilege, wife of a respected merchant, had been trafficked across borders into bondage. Her legal existence in the United States was obliterated through a falsified death, her memory buried under a marble stone that marked an empty grave. When Dr. McKinney learned of Fontenot's discovery, he revisited his earlier conclusions. In a 1980 article published in the Journal of Southern History, he wrote, "If Helena and Eleanor are indeed one and the same, then this case constitutes perhaps the most egregious documented instance of an American citizen sold into slavery by her own spouse. It is a crime of both domestic and national significance, a reminder that the boundaries between slavery and freedom were not lines of law, but of power." The case's notoriety grew modestly within academic circles, prompting others to search for additional evidence. In 1983, during restoration work at St. Andrew's Church itself, workers discovered a concealed compartment beneath the altar floor. Inside was a small tin container, its contents miraculously preserved against moisture. Within lay several folded letters addressed to Eleanor from her mother, Sarah Whitmore, along with a cameo brooch and a pair of reading glasses. A note accompanying them, written in the same hand as Jennings's earlier message, read, "Mrs. M's effects recovered after the service," hidden as conscience required. That discovery confirmed that Jennings had acted deliberately to preserve Eleanor's memory. Whether he hoped her story would someday be told, or simply sought to protect the tokens of a life unjustly erased, remains unknown. His small act of defiance, repeated twice, bridged the century-long silence between crime and revelation. By the late 1980s, historians had assembled a nearly complete chain of documentation. The death certificate signed by Dr. Pritchard, the judge's order to cease inquiries, the original bill of sale to Duval, the resale to Vega and Dupré, and the diary recovered from the house wall. What they could not provide, however, was closure. There were no known descendants of Jonathan Merriweather or Eleanor Whitmore. The Merriweather line ended with Jonathan's son by his second marriage, who died childless in 1920. The Whitmore family had migrated westward in the early 1900s, their connection to Savannah fading into obscurity. Yet the story refused to rest. In 1990, Dr. Rebecca Harrington published her comprehensive study, Erased, the Merriweather Case and the Legal Annihilation of Women in Antebellum America. Her analysis placed Eleanor's fate within a broader web of systemic subjugation. Coverture, Harrington wrote, was the quiet cousin of slavery. Both rested on the assumption that certain classes of people could be owned. Eleanor's tragedy lay not only in her husband's cruelty, but in a society that agreed she was his to dispose of. Her words resonated deeply during an era increasingly attentive to women's rights and historical silences. The Merriweather case became a symbol in academic discourse, a lens through which to examine how patriarchal law and slavery's moral corrosion intersected. Students studied her diary in seminars on gender and power. A small documentary, aired on Georgia Public Broadcasting in 1992, presented the story as The Vanished Wife of Savannah. And still, the question lingered. What became of Eleanor after that sale? Did she survive long enough to write or speak her truth in some distant colony? Did she maintain the fierce intelligence reflected in her letters, even when stripped of her name and freedom? In 2005, a faint but tantalizing clue surfaced in an unexpected archive. While digitizing 19th century business correspondence in Havana, a Cuban historian named Lucia Herrera discovered a letter from Carlos Vega, the same Spanish trader linked to Duval. Dated November 1839, it was addressed to a partner in Madrid. After routine discussion of tobacco shipments and exchange rates, a postscript read, "The American woman persists in claiming her free birth and Boston origin. She is troublesome, though of genteel manner. Correction has been necessary. If the French plan fails, I may send her further south, to Brazil perhaps. Will advise." It was the final known mention of the woman scholars believed to have been Eleanor Merriweather. The letter's detached cruelty, correction has been necessary, chills the blood even now. Somewhere between New Orleans, Havana, and Port-au-Prince, Eleanor's trail ends. Whether she lived months or years longer cannot be known. But the simple fact that she continued to assert her identity, to insist she was free and born in Boston, speaks to a courage that transcended her circumstances. When Savannah's archivists added the Havana letter to the Merriweather collection in 2006, they placed it beside her recovered portrait. Visitors who linger before the glass case often remark that the eyes in the miniature seem almost alive, as if aware of the cruel irony of her survival as an artifact while her body vanished into history. Beneath the museum's gentle lighting, the portrait and the letter sit side by side, the living and the lost, the proof of humanity beside the language of erasure. And yet, the story's most disturbing element may not be Jonathan Merriweather's act alone, but the city's quiet complicity, the way neighbors, clergy, doctors, and judges conspired, by silence or active deceit, to preserve his respectability. As the 20th century progressed, the Merriweather case evolved from a grim local legend into a mirror reflecting Savannah's uneasy conscience about its own past. The city, like many southern ports, had long wrapped its antebellum history in romantic imagery, azaleas blooming beneath wrought iron balconies, carriages passing under moss-draped oaks, the illusion of genteel civility unmarred by the brutal system that financed it all. But beneath that postcard vision lay the truth. Savannah had been a marketplace of bodies as much as of goods, a place where fortunes were made through human suffering. The Merriweather affair, when viewed against that broader backdrop, revealed how completely the city's institutions had been shaped by the logic of ownership and silence. By 1990, historians had mapped the network of complicity surrounding Eleanor's disappearance with unsettling precision. Dr. Samuel Pritchard, the physician who certified her death, had been a shareholder in the Savannah Mercantile Bank, where Jonathan Merriweather maintained credit. Judge Edward Rutledge, who ordered inquiries to cease, had invested in a shipping syndicate that used Merriweather's warehouses as its staging ground. Even the rector of St. Andrew's Parish, Reverend Josiah Moore, benefited from the patronage of the same mercantile families who stood to lose prestige if scandal touched one of their own. The pattern was unmistakable. These men, respectable, educated, pillars of Savannah's civic order, had all profited, directly or indirectly, from the social and economic machinery that enabled Merriweather's crime. Their participation in the cover-up was not an aberration, but an extension of their everyday moral reasoning. If a husband could legally own his wife's property, why not her person? If human beings could be bought and sold, what was one more transaction, provided it remained discreet? Dr. Rebecca Harrington's landmark 1990 study articulated this corruption with clarity that unsettled many readers. The horror of Eleanor Merriweather's fate, she wrote, lies not only in what her husband did, but in what others accepted. Her body was the currency through which Savannah's social order confirmed its own righteousness, a sacrifice to preserve appearances. Harrington's work reframed the case, not as an isolated tragedy, but as an emblem of the moral disease endemic to the antebellum South, where status, gender, and race intertwined to erode conscience. In 1992, the Savannah Historical Society convened a small symposium devoted to the case. Among the attendees were legal scholars, archivists, and a few descendants of families once connected to the Merriweathers' social circle. Most treated the topic with academic detachment, but a few older attendees, descendants of the Rutledges and Pritchards, bristled at the implications. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, the story exaggerated by modern sensibilities. Yet the documents spoke for themselves: the death certificate, the sale records, the Havana letter. The weight of proof rendered denial almost farcical. Still, official recognition came slowly. Savannah, like many southern cities, preferred its ghosts genteel and its scandals discreet. The Merriweather house remained a private residence, unmarked by any plaque or acknowledgement of its history. The owners who purchased it in the early 2000s refused to allow interior tours, citing privacy and superstition. They admitted, however, to a somber atmosphere in the cellar, the same space where Eleanor's diary and personal effects had been discovered decades earlier. Workers restoring the brickwork reported sudden chills and an inexplicable reluctance to remain there alone. Whether born of imagination or something less tangible, the unease persisted. Local guides whispered about the house, but it never appeared on Savannah's official ghost tours. The story lacked the easy theatrics of rattling chains or spectral lights. It offered something far more unsettling, not the haunting of a house, but of a conscience. By the mid-2000s, renewed academic interest in gender and legal history brought the Merriweather case back into scholarly discussion. Graduate students at the University of Georgia and Emory re-examined the surviving documents, producing dissertations that analyze coverture laws, marital property rights, and the porous boundaries between free and enslaved status in border economies. One paper noted that in 1839, the same year Eleanor vanished, Savannah's city council passed an ordinance simplifying the process by which slave traders could register mulatto servants recently arrived by ship. That bureaucratic convenience may have provided the very loophole Jonathan exploited, allowing him to pass off his fair-skinned wife as a mixed-race domestic newly imported from the Caribbean. The possibility raised deeper questions about race and identity in antebellum law. A genealogical study conducted in 1986 had already revealed that Eleanor's maternal grandmother had been French Creole from Louisiana, a fact distant enough to have little social consequence in Boston, but devastatingly exploitable in the South's obsessive racial hierarchy. If Jonathan wished to justify his sale legally, even the whisper of non-white ancestry could suffice to classify his wife as of mixed blood. Historians now believe he used that technicality to mask his crime, describing her in the bill of sale as light-complexioned and Boston origin, knowing the law would favor property claims over human rights. Such manipulations were not unique. Records from the same period document several cases of free people, particularly those of ambiguous ancestry, kidnapped or fraudulently sold into slavery. Most were poor and black, without the means to resist or the connections to be missed. What set Eleanor's case apart was her whiteness, education, and class, and how little those privileges ultimately protected her once the machinery of male and racial power turned against her. In 2007, another fragment surfaced to deepen the mystery. While digitizing the archives of a Havana trading company, researchers uncovered a second letter by Carlos Vega, written in December 1839, 2 months after the first. The document discussed the disposition of the American woman, noting tersely, "She has been conveyed to Saint-Domingue interior, where her tongue will no longer stir trouble." The phrase, chilling in its finality, suggested that Eleanor's refusal to accept her enslaved status, her insistence on speaking of Boston and freedom, had provoked her captors to remove her father from any chance of recognition or escape. After this, the trail ends. No record of Helena or any comparable figure appears in Saint-Domingue or Haitian archives. Some scholars speculate she may have died en route to the plantation, succumbing to disease or despair. Others suggest she might have lived for years in enforced silence, her memories her only resistance. In the absence of proof, Eleanor's final chapter remains a void, a silence as deliberate as the one her husband and his allies constructed in 1839. For modern historians, that silence is its own testimony. It exposes how thoroughly entire lives could vanish into bureaucratic ledgers and forged documents. It reveals how communities built on oppression perfected the art of forgetting. Dr. Harrington once observed that the true horror of the Merriweather affair is not that it was exceptional, but that it was possible. In Savannah's historic district today, tourists stroll through shaded squares, admiring Greek Revival townhouses and listening to tales of pirates, duels, and ghostly apparitions. Few know that beneath their feet, in the archives and attics of those same buildings, lie fragments of a story that defies all romantic gloss. A story in which civility cloaked cruelty, and law conspired with power to erase a woman who dared to assert her own humanity. Yet Eleanor's voice, faint though it is, endures in the letters she wrote, the diaries she hid, the defiant declarations captured in a trader's correspondence across an ocean. Her story, reconstructed from fragments, became not just an indictment of one man's cruelty, but a parable of how entire societies conspire to bury their sins. The Savannah Historical Society's exhibit, established in 2010, finally acknowledged that truth. Beneath the soft lights of the museum gallery, visitors can view Eleanor's miniature portrait beside the Havana letter, the gloves, the comb, and the diary's fragile pages. The exhibit's final line, engraved on a small brass plate, reads simply, "Let truth prevail." It is the same phrase inscribed on the bronze plaque that now marks her empty grave at St. Andrew's churchyard. A quiet declaration, but an enduring one. The installation of the bronze plaque at St. Andrew's churchyard in 2010 marked the first public acknowledgement that the marble headstone above the empty grave did not, and never had, sheltered the remains of Eleanor Whitmore Merriweather. It was a modest ceremony. Fewer than 20 people gathered in the churchyard's filtered light, as the rector read from a short dedication written by Dr. Rebecca Harrington. Here lies the memory of a woman taken from freedom into bondage, and from life into silence. Let truth prevail. The bell tolled once, the sound thin and hesitant, as if uncertain whether it had permission to break a silence that had lasted more than a century and a half. For Savannah, a city steeped in heritage tourism and selective remembrance, the plaque represented a quiet revolution. The Merriweather case was no longer whispered about in footnotes or confined to the archives. It had entered the public landscape, yet even in acknowledgement, the story remained troubling. Local newspapers covered the ceremony briefly, framing it as a historical curiosity, a grim footnote to the city's colorful past. Few wanted to dwell on what it implied about Savannah's complicity, or the broader moral rot of a society that had allowed such an atrocity to unfold behind lace curtains and polite conversation. Dr. Harrington, in interviews, insisted the story was not about ghosts, but about systems. Eleanor's absence haunts us, she said, not because she lingers as a spirit, but because her erasure mirrors every injustice we choose not to see. When we look away, we repeat the silence that buried her. Her words carried weight beyond the confines of historical scholarship. In classrooms across Georgia, teachers began using the Merriweather story to illustrate the intersections of slavery, gender, and law. It forced students to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the architecture of oppression was not only built on fields and auction blocks, but also within drawing rooms, courtrooms, and marriage contracts. During the 2010s, Savannah underwent a broader reckoning with its past. Historical tours that once celebrated the elegance of the antebellum elite began to include frank discussions of the enslaved labor that sustained it. The city's museums reinterpreted their exhibits to acknowledge the violence underpinning its prosperity. Within this climate, the Merriweather case gained renewed relevance as a symbol of the thin line between privilege and vulnerability, how even a woman born free and white could, through the combined forces of greed, law, and patriarchy, find herself reduced to property. In 2013, the Savannah Museum of History opened a dedicated gallery titled Erased Lives, Stories of the Forgotten. At its heart was the Merriweather display, a recreation of the parlor where Eleanor was last seen, furnished with period-accurate decor and lit to mimic the heavy stillness of coastal twilight. The miniature portrait, the diary, and the Havana letters sat beneath glass, illuminated with soft amber light. Visitors lingered longest before the diary's final words, scrawled in shaky ink. He speaks now of debts and voyages. I have written to William. I fear the letter will not leave this house. For those who read the line aloud, the effect was visceral. The immediacy of a human voice breaking through centuries of silence. One visitor, a novelist from North Carolina, later wrote that the room felt alive with quiet defiance, as if she were still there, insisting we listen. That same year, a small team of historians and anthropologists from Tulane University and the University of Georgia launched an ambitious project to trace Eleanor's possible route through the Caribbean. They combed port registries, plantation logs, and baptismal records across New Orleans, Havana, and Cap Haitian. In a warehouse in Port-au-Prince, they found a fragment of a shipping manifest from 1840 listing a Helena domestic servant, literate, age 24, among passengers aboard the French schooner Maréchal Ney. The vessel's destination was recorded simply as Plantation du Pré. The fragment, though inconclusive, offered the most specific lead yet. Dr. Lucia Herrera, who had discovered the Havana letter years earlier, traveled to the rural north of Haiti to search for remnants of the Dupré estate. Among the ruins of a plantation house long since reclaimed by vegetation, she found a small marble plaque half buried in the earth. Its inscription, faint but legible, read, Hélène, servante fidèle. Morte en 1842. No surname, no birth date. Only that brief acknowledgement of service and death. Herrera photographed the find and sent it to Savannah. When the image appeared in the Atlantic Historical Review later that year, it sparked quiet debate. Some scholars accepted it as the likely endpoint of Eleanor's tragic odyssey. Others urged caution, noting that Helena was a common name. But for many, the coincidence was too striking to ignore. The timing, the location, the literacy, the link to Dupré. If it was her, then Eleanor had lived 3 years beyond her disappearance. Long enough to endure and perhaps resist in ways history will never record. The realization that she might have died under a false name in a foreign land lent the story a new dimension of grief. Yet it also reframed her narrative as one of endurance. Even stripped of her identity, she had persisted. Even after her world conspired to erase her, traces of her existence refused to vanish. Back in Savannah, the Merriweather house underwent another renovation. The owners, a pair of preservation-minded architects, agreed to allow limited tours in cooperation with the Historical Society. They restored the cellar to its original condition, preserving the sealed section of wall where the diary had been found. Visitors describe an oppressive stillness in that space, a sense of heavy air and faint, inexplicable chills. The guides make no mention of hauntings. They speak, instead of atmosphere, of the weight that accumulates when truth is buried for too long. In 2015, a film crew documenting Southern ghost stories requested permission to include the house in their series. The owners declined. "It's not a ghost story," one of them told a reporter. "It's a story about what people are capable of doing when power goes unchecked. The only thing haunting here is history itself." The house stands today as a private residence, its façade immaculate, its story whispered among scholars and preservationists. Across the street, a small historical marker describes Jonathan Merriweather as a merchant and civic leader, though a local campaign has begun to amend the plaque to include the truth. The debate has proven divisive. Some residents fear that reintroducing such darkness into Savannah's narrative will tarnish the city's image. Others argue that acknowledgement is the only path to redemption. Meanwhile, the archives continue to yield fragments. In 2017, during cataloging at a Boston library, a scholar uncovered a letter written by William Whitmore in late 1839, addressed to an attorney. It contained a cryptic line, "I fear the worst. The man is capable of villainy beyond measure. I have written to the authorities in Georgia, but Judge R. will not act." The letter ended with a vow. If justice may not be had, then memory must suffice. That single sentence became the epigraph of the 2018 exhibition, Memory Must Suffice, The Lost Women of the South, which included Eleanor's case alongside other forgotten histories. The exhibit's curator observed, her brother could not bring her back, but his words foretold what history would one day attempt, to restore her memory when justice was denied. Through these layers of remembrance, the Merriweather case has transformed from a scandal into a moral allegory. Each rediscovery, the diary, the bills of sale, the Havana letters, the plantation plaque, functions as a pulse of resistance against oblivion. The documents themselves, once scattered across nations, seem to conspire toward the same end, that her name, once buried, be spoken again, and perhaps that is the truest haunting. Not the ghost of a woman wandering her former home, but the persistent echo of her existence refusing to fade, demanding acknowledgement from the living. The historian's task, as Dr. Harrington once said, is to listen to what silence tries hardest to conceal. Savannah's silence has grown thinner with each decade. The cobblestones of Oglethorpe Avenue still gleam after rain. The gas lamps still flicker above polished doorways. But for those who know where to look, the city's beauty now carries an undertone, a quiet reminder that beneath every story of gentility lies another of cruelty. And yet, in that recognition lies a kind of grace. To remember is to resist erasure, To speak the names of the lost is to loosen history's grip on its own lies. As twilight falls over Savannah's historic district, the same streets that once carried the sound of horse hooves and the clatter of merchant carts grow still beneath the weight of their own remembering. The lamplight flickers on brick facades softened by centuries of salt air, and the great oaks along Oglethorpe Avenue sway in the slow, humid wind. Those who pass the Merriweather house today see only elegance, its cream-colored shutters, its iron balconies framed by ivy. Yet behind those walls lingers a silence older than any paint or plaster. It is the silence of a story almost erased, then whispered back into being. The modern visitor, strolling through the district's preserved squares, would find no mention of the Merriweathers on the city's official maps. Tour guides speak of pirates and poets, of duels fought for honor and fortunes made in cotton, but they rarely mention the merchant who sold his wife, nor the woman whose name was written out of the record and buried beneath a false stone. Her story survives not through monuments or legend, but through fragments. An ink-stained diary, a letter in a trader's hand, a portrait's quiet gaze. Each piece carries a tremor of what was lost, and together they form the faint outline of a life that power sought to erase. The Savannah Historical Society still keeps the Merriweather collection in a temperature-controlled room beneath its main gallery. Researchers describe the space as unusually still, its air dense with the must of preserved paper and leather bindings. Within one glass case rests the box Thomas Jennings sealed in secret, the gloves, the comb, the miniature portrait, and beside it, the note written in his trembling hand. They should not have been buried with an empty coffin. Visitors sometimes stand for long minutes before the display, saying nothing, as though words might disturb the fragile equilibrium between past and present. Some claim the room feels colder than the rest of the building. The curators say it is simply the air conditioning. Others aren't so sure. What remains most disturbing about the Merriweather affair is not its singular cruelty, but its ordinariness. The crime required no act of overt violence that Savannah society could not ignore. It demanded only signatures, silence, and cooperation. The merchant's wealth, the doctor's pen, the judge's decree. Each played its role in transforming a living woman into a legal fiction. And then, for more than a century, the city continued the deception by doing what it had always done best, forgetting. The marble headstone weathered in the churchyard, the ledgers yellowed in drawers, and the polite descendants of those complicit men built their reputations upon the rubble of omission. When Dr. Harrington published her final essay on the case in 2019, she concluded with a reflection that feels like an epitaph, not just for Eleanor, but for the society that betrayed her. "History's cruelty," she wrote, "is that it keeps our secrets until we are ready to confront them." Eleanor Merriweather vanished because her existence challenged the illusion that slavery's evil was limited by race. She died, or was made to die, because even whiteness could not shield a woman from ownership when the law itself sanctioned possession. Her words resonated far beyond the academy. That same year, the Savannah City Council approved a plan to mark sites associated with forgotten women's histories, and St. Andrew's Churchyard was among the first to receive recognition. A new plaque, set beside Eleanor's false grave, bears both her birth name and the name found in the Caribbean records, Eleanor Whitmore Merriweather, Helena, born free. Died enslaved, 1817-1842. Below it, in smaller letters, are Jennings's words, "Let truth prevail." For many, that quiet acknowledgement seemed to close the circle. Yet those who visit the site often speak of the feeling that something remains unfinished, not in a supernatural sense, but as an ethical echo. Her story continues to demand something more than remembrance. It insists on vigilance. It reminds us that injustice is rarely the work of monsters, but of ordinary people doing what seems convenient, respectable, or necessary at the time. The Merriweather house still stands. Privately owned, its cellar now stabilized and open by appointment for research. The sealed wall where Eleanor's diary was found remains untouched, preserved behind glass. On rare occasions, visiting scholars describe an odd sensation when standing before it. A faint vibration in the air, as though the bricks themselves were exhaling after decades of holding their secret. Others feel nothing at all except a quiet sorrow. In 2020, during a symposium on historical memory, a young historian from Savannah State University presented a paper titled The Architecture of Erasure. She ended her talk by reading the final entry from Eleanor's diary aloud to a packed auditorium. When she finished, the room remained silent for nearly a minute. Then she said, "Every city has its missing people, its silenced names. Ours just happened to be found in the cellar of a merchant's house. Outside, the city's streets glowed with late afternoon light, and for a brief moment, Savannah seemed to listen. The rediscovery of Eleanor's story has transformed the way historians understand the permeability of freedom in antebellum America. It reveals that liberty, even for those born into privilege, was never absolute but conditional, dependent on gender, law, and the goodwill of those who held power. It also exposes the ease with which entire communities could choose ignorance over truth, respectability over justice. The institutions that should have protected Eleanor, the church, the court, the medical profession, instead became instruments of her disappearance. And yet, against that vast machinery of deceit, small acts of resistance endured. The sexton who preserved her belongings, the soldier who filed an inconvenient report, the scholars who pieced together her trail from scattered archives. Each, knowingly or not, carried the torch of memory forward until it burned bright enough to pierce the dark. Today, tourists who wander through St. Andrew's churchyard see two stones side by side, the original marble headstone, its inscription fading, and the bronze plaque gleaming beside it. Few pause long enough to notice the discrepancy in the dates or the emptiness beneath, but those who do often speak softly, as if entering a sacred space. The grave may hold no body, but it has become a vessel for something more enduring: acknowledgement. As dusk deepens and the last light fades over the river, the sounds of the modern city recede into the steady rhythm of the tide. The air grows heavy with the scent of salt and magnolia, and the bells of St. Andrew's toll the hour. Somewhere beyond the reach of record or reason, one might imagine Eleanor standing by the water's edge, the same edge where ships once carried her into oblivion. Her face is turned toward the horizon, her expression unreadable, not vengeful, not mournful, but calm, as if she knows that time at last, has bent toward truth. The historian's work is never to grant peace to the dead, but to deny comfort to the living when comfort is built on forgetting. In that sense, the story of Eleanor Whitmore Merriweather is unfinished, not because we do not know how it ends, but because its lessons continue. Each document recovered, each word read aloud, is a small act of restoration against centuries of erasure. The bronze plaque in St. Andrew's churchyard catches the last glimmer of twilight. The words engraved upon it barely visible now: "Let truth prevail." The night settles in, soft and humid, over a city that has learned, at least for a moment, to remember. And beneath that quiet remembrance lies the echo of a question history still asks of us all. When faced with injustice, will we choose silence or will we let truth prevail? The answer, like the faint scent of salt drifting up from the river, lingers in the air long after the story ends.